Pythagoras and the Delphic Mysteries, by Edouard Schure. Chapter 1. Greece in the 6th century. The soul of Orpheus had swept like a celestial meteor across the tempestuous heavens of a nascent Greece. Upon the dissipation of this meteor, the land was once more shrouded in darkness. Following a succession of political upheavals, the tyrants of Thrace consigned his volumes to the flames, demolished his temples, and banished his disciples. The sovereigns and numerous city-states of Greece emulated this example, being far more jealous of their own unbridled license than of that justice which constitutes the wellspring of pure doctrine. They were resolved to obliterate his very memory, leaving no vestige of his existence. And in this they succeeded so thoroughly that, several centuries after his demise, a portion of Greece questioned whether he had ever existed at all. In vain did the initiates preserve his tradition for upwards of a millennium. In vain did Pythagoras and Plato speak of him as a divine being. For the sophists and rhetoricians perceived in him nothing more than a myth concerning the origin of music. Even in the contemporary era, scholars vigorously deny the existence of Orpheus, premising their assertion upon the fact that neither Homer nor Hesiod makes mention of his name. The silence of these poets, however, is amply explained by the interdict with which the local authorities had constrained the great initiator. The disciples of Orpheus neglected no opportunity to rally all temporal powers beneath the supreme authority of the Temple of Delphi, and ceaselessly asserted that the disputes arising among the various states of Greece ought to be adjudicated before the council of the Amphictyons. This proposition was equally displeasing to demagogues and tyrants. Homer, who in all probability received his initiation within the sanctuary of Tyre, and whose mythology represents a poetic translation of the theology of Sanconiaton, Homer the Ionian might well have remained entirely ignorant of the Dorian Orpheus, whose tradition was preserved with a secrecy proportional to the persecution it invited. As for Hesiod, born in the vicinity of Parnassus, he must indeed have been acquainted with the name and doctrine of Orpheus through the temple at Delphi. However, silence was imposed upon him by his initiators, and that for compelling reasons. Yet Orpheus lived on in his work, in his disciples, and even in the very minds of those who denied his existence. What, then, constitutes this work, and where is the vital essence of his life to be sought? Is it to be found in the ferocious, militaristic oligarchy of Sparta, where science was despised, ignorance systematically cultivated, and brutality demanded as the necessary complement to courage? Is it in those implacable Messenian wars wherein the Spartans persecuted a neighboring populace to the brink of extermination, these Romans of Greece prefiguring the Tarpeian Rock and the blood-stained laurels of the capital by casting the heroic Aristomenes, the defender of his homeland, into a yawning abyss? Or should it rather be sought within the turbulent democracy of Athens, perpetually poised to degenerate into tyranny? Or in the Praetorian Guard of Pisistratus, or the dagger of Harmodius and Aristogiton, concealed beneath a branch of myrtle? Or within the myriad towns and cities of Hellas, of Magna Graecia, and of Asia Minor, of which Athens and Sparta present two antithetical models? Does it reside within these envious and rancorous democracies and tyrannies, ever prepared to rend one another asunder? Assuredly, the soul of Greece is not to be found there. Rather, it abides in her temples, her mysteries, and their initiates. It dwells within the sanctuary of Jupiter at Olympia, of Juno at Argos, and of Ceres at Eleusis. It reigns over Athens in the person of Minerva, and diffuses its radiance over Delphi through Apollo, who suffuses every temple with his light. Here lies the crucible of Hellenic life, the very heart and intellect of Greece. Hither journeyed poets to receive instruction, translating sublime truths into vivid imagery for the populace, and sages who disseminated these verities through the medium of subtle dialectic. The spirit of Orpheus is palpable wherever the heart of immortal Greece beats. We discern it in poetic and gymnastic contests, in the Delphic and Olympian games, a magnificent institution established by the successors of the master with the design of reconciling and unifying the 12 Greek tribes. We are brought into direct communion with it in the court of the Amphictyons, that assembly of illustrious initiates, a supreme and sovereign tribunal convening at Delphi, a magnificent center of justice and concord, wherein alone Greece reclaimed her unity during epochs of heroism and self-abnegation. Yet Greece, which in the age of Orpheus possessed an intellect of unsullied, sanctuary-guarded doctrine, a soul of plastic religion, and a body represented by a noble court of justice centered at Delphi, had begun to decline by the early 7th century. The decrees issued from Delphi were no longer revered. The sacred territories were violated. The lineage of divinely inspired men had vanished. The intellectual and moral stature of the sanctuaries deteriorated, and the priesthood prostituted itself to politicians. From that epoch, the mysteries themselves fell into corruption. The overall landscape of Greece was transformed. The ancient sacerdotal and agrarian monarchy was succeeded either by absolute tyranny, by a military aristocracy, or by an anarchic democracy. The temples had grown impotent to arrest the impending ruin. A new deliverer was required. It became necessary, therefore, to popularize the esoteric teachings. In order that the thought of Orpheus might endure and flourish in all its splendor, the wisdom of the temples had to descend to the laity. Accordingly, under various guises, it permeated the minds of civil legislators, the schools of the poets, and the porticos of the philosophers. These latter sages recognized in their instruction the very necessity that Orpheus had perceived in religion, the existence of two doctrines, the one public and the other esoteric, manifesting the same truth in varying degrees and forms, adapted to the intellectual capacity of the disciple. This evolution bequeathed to Greece her 3 magnificent centuries of artistic creation and intellectual splendor. It enabled Orphic thought, simultaneously the primal impulse and the ideal synthesis of Greece, to concentrate its full radiance and diffuse it throughout the civilized world, before her political edifice, undermined by intestine strife, tottered under the ascendancy of Macedon and ultimately collapsed beneath the iron hand of Rome. Numerous figures contributed to this historical evolution. It brought forth natural philosophers such as Thales, legislators like Solon, poets like Pindar, and heroes of the stature of Epaminondas. It possessed, moreover, an acknowledged leader, an initiate of the highest order, endowed with a sovereign, organizing, and creative intellect. Pythagoras stands as the preceptor of secular Greece, even as Orpheus was the master of her sacerdotal realm. He translated and perpetuated the religious thought of his predecessor, adapting it to the exigencies of a new epoch. His translation, nonetheless, constituted a distinct creation, for he coordinated the Orphic inspirations into a comprehensive system, furnishing scientific demonstration thereof in his teachings, and moral validation within his educational institute and the Pythagorean order that outlived him. Though emerging in the full light of historical antiquity, Pythagoras has descended to posterity as an almost legendary figure. The primary cause of this lies in the terrible persecution of which he was the victim in Sicily, a campaign that claimed the lives of so many of his adherents. Some were crushed to death beneath the ruins of their immolated academies, whilst others perished of hunger within the temples. The memory and teachings of the master were preserved solely by those few survivors who succeeded in escaping to Greece. Plato, at immense pains and expense, obtained through Archytas a manuscript of the master, who, it must be observed, never committed his esoteric doctrines to writing save through the medium of symbols and cryptic characters. His true work, like that of all great reformers, was accomplished through oral instruction. The essence of his system, however, has been transmitted to us in the golden verses of Lysis, the commentary of Hierocles, the fragments of Philolaus, and the Timaeus of Plato, which preserves the Pythagorean cosmogony. In sum, the writers of antiquity are thoroughly imbued with the spirit of the philosopher of Croton. These ancient writers never weary of recounting anecdotes that depict his wisdom, his physical beauty, and his wondrous ascendancy over mankind. The Neoplatonists of Alexandria, the Gnostics, and even the early fathers of the Church invoke his name as an authority. These constitute precious witnesses through whom one may feel the continuous vibration of that formidable wave of enthusiasm which the towering personality of Pythagoras succeeded in imparting to Greece, a spiritual impulse whose final ripples were still discernible 8 centuries after his demise. His doctrine, when viewed from a loftier perspective and decrypted by means of comparative esotericism, reveals a magnificent synthesis, the diverse elements of which are united by a single fundamental conception. Within it lies a rational exposition of the esoteric teachings of India and Egypt, which he illuminated with Hellenic clarity and simplicity, thereby endowing it with a more profound sensibility and a more lucid comprehension of human liberty. Simultaneously, across various regions of the globe, illustrious reformers were popularizing comparable doctrines. In China, Lao Tse was emerging from the esotericism of Fohai. On the banks of the Ganges, the last Buddha, Sakyamuni, was preaching, while in Italy, the Etruscan priesthood dispatched to Rome an initiate custodian of the Sibylline books. This was King Numa, who, through the establishment of wise institutions, sought to restrain the menacing ambition of the Roman Senate. It was by no means accidental that these reformers emerged concurrently among such disparate peoples. Their diverse missions converged toward a single common purpose. They demonstrate that, during certain epochs, a uniform spiritual current mysteriously pervades the whole of humanity. Whence does it arise? It has its source in that celestial realm, far removed from mortal sight, of which prophets and seers are the emissaries and testifiers. Pythagoras traversed the entirety of the ancient world before delivering his message to Greece. He observed Africa and Asia, Memphis and Babylon, studying their initiatory rites and political institutions. His own tumultuous existence resembles a vessel navigating a tempest, steadfastly pursuing its course with sails unfurled, an emblem of fortitude and serenity amidst the fury of the elements. His teachings evoke the sensation of a cool, fragrant night following the searing heat and passion of a tempestuous, blood-stained day. They recall the splendor of the firmament, gradually revealing its glittering stellar archipelagos and celestial harmonies above the head of the seer. And let us now endeavor to delineate both his life and his doctrine, stripping away alike the obscurities of legend and the preconceptions of the schools. Chapter 2. Years of Travel. At the commencement of the 6th century before our era, Samos stood as one of the most prosperous islands of Ionia. Its harbor faced the violet peaks of a dormant Asia Minor, a realm of opulence and allure. The city was situated on a broad bay with verdant shores, ascending tier upon tier up the mountainside in the manner of an amphitheater, situated at the base of a promontory crowned by the Temple of Neptune. It was dominated by the colonnades of a grand palace, the residence of the tyrant Polycrates. Having despoiled Samos of her liberty, he nevertheless endowed the island with the full luster of artistic achievement and Asiatic magnificence. At his behest, courtesans from Lesbos had established themselves in an adjacent palace, where they entertained the youths and maidens of the city. At these festivities, they initiated them into the most refined pleasures, accompanied by music, dance, and banqueting. Anacreon, summoned by Polycrates, was conveyed to Samos aboard a trireme adorned with purple sails and gilded masts. There, goblet of chased silver in hand, the poet sang his languid odes before this preeminent court of pleasure. The prosperity of Polycrates had become legendary throughout Greece. He counted among his allies the pharaoh Amasis, who frequently cautioned him to remain wary of such uninterrupted fortune, and, above all, to eschew hubris. Polycrates responded to the Egyptian monarch's admonitions by casting his ring into the sea. "This sacrifice I offer unto the gods," he declared. On the succeeding day, a fisherman returned the precious jewel to the tyrant, having discovered it within the belly of a fish. Upon learning of this occurrence, the pharaoh resolved to sever his alliance with Polycrates, pronouncing that such insolent fortune would inevitably provoke the wrath of the deities. Whatever historical validity one may accord to this anecdote, the ultimate fate of Polycrates was undeniably tragic. One of his satraps lured him into an adjacent province, subjected him to fatal torture, and commanded that his corpse be affixed to a cross on Mount Mycale. Thus, one evening, as the sanguine orb of the sun descended in the west, the populace of Samos beheld the body of their tyrant, crucified upon a promontory within view of the island over which he had ruled with such glory and self-indulgence. To return, however, to the inception of Polycrates' reign. On a starlit night, a young man sat within a grove of Agnus Castus, its foliage shimmering in the darkness, at no great distance from the temple of Juno, whose Doric facade was bathed in the lunar rays, enhancing the mystical majesty of the structure. A papyrus scroll, bearing a canto of Homer, had slipped to the ground and lay at his feet. His contemplation, commenced at twilight, persisted into the silence of the night. Although the sun had long since descended below the horizon, its blazing disk still danced as an illusory presence before the eyes of the youthful dreamer. His intellect had strayed far from the realm of tangible phenomena. Pythagoras was the offspring of a prosperous Samian lapidary and a woman named Parthenes. The Pythoness of Delphi, consulted by the young spouses during a journey, had promised them a son who would prove of service to all mankind and for all eternity. The oracle had directed them to Sidon in Phoenicia in order that this predestined child might be conceived, fashioned, and born far from the disruptive influences of his native land. Even prior to his birth, during the nuptial moon, the wondrous child had been fervently consecrated by his parents to the worship of Apollo. Upon the child's birth, and when he had attained his first year, his mother, adhering to the counsel previously received from the Delphic priest, conveyed him to the temple of Adonai in a valley of Lebanon. There, The high priest bestowed his blessing upon him, whereupon the family returned to Samos. The son of Parthenes was exceedingly beautiful, gentle, serene, and composed. An intellectual passion alone flashed from his eyes, imparting a hidden vigor to his deeds. Far from discouraging him, his parents had fostered his precocious inclination toward the pursuit of wisdom. He had been permitted the liberty to converse with the priests of Samos and the scholars who were then beginning to found schools in Ionia dedicated to the principles of natural philosophy. At the age of 18, he attended the discourses of Hermodamas of Samos. At 20, those of Pherecydes at Syros. He had, moreover, consulted with Thales and Anaximander at Miletus. These preceptors had revealed new horizons to him, yet none had afforded him complete satisfaction. Amidst their conflicting doctrines, he sought to discern the cohesive bond and synthesis, the unity of the grand cosmos. The son of Parthenes had now arrived at one of those crises wherein the intellect, overstimulated by the contradictions of existence, concentrates its entire faculties in a supreme endeavor to perceive the ultimate end, to discover a path leading toward the sun of truth, the very center of vitality. Throughout that magnificent night, Pythagoras directed his gaze successively toward the earth, the temple, and the starry firmament. Demeter, the earth mother, nature, whose mysteries he yearned to fathom, surrounded and lay beneath him. He inhaled her potent emanations, sensing the irresistible attraction that bound him, a conscious atom, to her bosom as an inseparable part of her being. The sages he had consulted had declared to him, "It is from her that all arises. Nothing is created from nothing. The soul originates from water or fire or indeed from both. This subtle emanation of the elements departs from them only to return. Eternal nature is blind and inexorable. Resign thyself to her sovereign laws. Thy sole merit shall consist in thy comprehension of them, and thy resignation to their decree." Thereupon, he gazed toward the firmament and the incandescent characters traced by the constellations in the unfathomable abysses of space. These symbols must surely possess a meaning. For if the infinitesimal, the motion of atoms, has its reason for existence, why should not the infinitely great, the widely dispersed stars whose groupings delineate the corpus of the universe? Indeed, each of these worlds is governed by its own law, and all move in unison in accordance with numerical measure and in supreme harmony. But who shall ever decipher the alphabet of the stars? The priests of Juno had once said to him, "This is the heaven of the gods, which antedated the earth. Thence thy soul originates. Offer thy prayers to them, that it may ascend once more to the celestial realm." These contemplations were interrupted by a voluptuous chant, emanating from a garden upon the banks of the Embraces. The sensual voices of the lesbian women, in languishing strains, were heard accompanying the music of the cithara, answered by the baksheek melodies chanted by the youths. Suddenly other cries, shrill and plaintive, arising from the direction of the harbor, mingled with these voices. These were the lamentations of rebels whom Polycrates was embarking for sale into servitude in Asia. They were scourged with nail-studded thongs to compel them to crouch beneath the pontoons of the rowers. Their shrieks and profane cries died away in the night, and silence once more reigned over all. A painful shudder coursed through the young man's frame, which he suppressed in an effort to regain his composure. The enigma lay before him, more urgent and poignant than ever. Earth said, "Destiny, Heaven said, Providence. Humanity, poised between the two, replied, Madness, suffering, servitude. In the depths of his own being, however, the future adept heard an invincible voice responding to the shackles of earth and the blazing heavens with the cry, Liberty. Who was correct, the sages or the priests, the wretched or the mad, or was it he himself? In truth, all these voices spoke the verity. Each triumphed within its own sphere, yet none revealed to him its reason for existence. The three worlds coexisted, immutable as the heart of Demeter, the light of the constellations, and the human breast. Yet only he who could reconcile them and discern the law of their equilibrium would be truly wise. He alone would possess divine knowledge and be capable of succoring humanity. It was within the synthesis of these three worlds that the secret of the cosmos lay. As he gave voice to this newly attained revelation, Pythagoras rose to his feet. His ardent gaze was fixed upon the Doric facade of the temple. The majestic edifice appeared transfigured beneath the chaste beams of Diana. Therein he believed he discerned the ideal archetype of the world and the resolution of the enigma he pursued. The plinth, the columns, the architrave, and the triangular pediment suddenly represented, to his sight, the threefold nature of man and the universe, of the microcosm and the macrocosm crowned by divine unity, itself a trinity. The cosmos, governed and permeated by the divine, formed the sacred quaternion, the source of nature, whose cause is eternal. Indeed, concealed within these geometrical lines lay the key to the universe. The science of numbers, the ternary law regulating the constitution of beings, and the septenary law governing their evolution. Pythagoras beheld the worlds traversing space in accordance with the rhythm and harmony of the sacred numbers. He perceived the equilibrium of earth and heaven, over which human liberty holds dominion, the three worlds, natural, human, and divine, mutually sustaining and determining one another, and enacting the universal drama in a dual movement of ascent and descent. He distinguished the spheres of the invisible that envelop the visible world and perpetually animate it. Finally, he conceived of the purification and liberation of man upon this globe through a threefold initiation. All this he beheld, together with his destiny and his life's work, in an instantaneous flash of illumination, with the absolute certitude of a spirit brought face to face with truth. Now must he demonstrate through reason that which his pure intelligence had received from the Absolute, and this endeavor demanded a human lifetime. It was a Herculean task. Where could he acquire the knowledge requisite to bring such a labor to a successful consummation? Neither the epics of Homer, nor the sages of Ionia, nor the temples of Greece would suffice. The spirit of Pythagoras, having suddenly found its wings, began to plunge into his past, into his mist-shrouded birth and his mother's mysterious love. The memories of his childhood returned to him with striking clarity. He recalled that his mother had borne him in her arms, when he was a mere babe of 12 months, to the temple of Adonai in a valley of Lebanon. He envisioned himself once more as a child, clinging to the neck of Parthenis, surrounded by vast forests and towering mountains, while a neighboring river cascaded nearby. She stood upon a terrace shaded by majestic cedars. Before her stood a priest of majestic mien and silver beard, who smiled upon the mother and child as he uttered solemn words that the infant could not comprehend. Frequently had his mother recalled to his mind the singular utterance of the Hierophant of Adonai. O woman of Ionia, thy son shall be great in wisdom, but remember that, Though the Greeks still possess the science of the gods, the knowledge of God can no longer be found elsewhere than in Egypt. These words return to him, accompanied by his mother's smile, the venerable beauty of the elder's countenance, and the distant murmur of the waterfall surmounted by the priest's voice, amidst that magnificent landscape, like the dream of a former life. For the first time he divined the meaning of the oracle. He had indeed heard of the wondrous knowledge of the Egyptian priests and of their formidable mysteries, though he had hitherto believed himself capable of dispensing with them. Now he understood that he required this divine science to penetrate to the very heart of nature, and that it could be found only within the sanctuaries of Egypt. It was the gentle Parthenes who, guided by maternal instinct, had prepared him for this monumental task and offered him as a dedication to the sovereign Lord. From that moment, he resolved to journey to Egypt and there submit to initiation. Polycrates prided himself upon being the patron of philosophers no less than of poets. He readily granted Pythagoras a letter of recommendation to Pharaoh Amasis, who subsequently introduced him to the priesthood of Memphis. The latter were averse to receiving him, and were induced to consent only with the greatest difficulty. The Egyptian sages harbored a distrust of the Greeks, whom they accused of being volatile and inconstant. They employed every means to dishearten the young Samian. The novice, however, submitted with unwavering patience and fortitude to the protractions and ordeals imposed upon him. He knew beforehand that he would attain to wisdom only by establishing absolute dominion over his will throughout his entire being. His initiation under the pontificate of Sancus, the high priest, endured for 22 years. All the trials and temptations, the soul-rending dread and ecstatic rapture experienced by Hermes, the initiate of Isis, even to the apparent or cataleptic death of the adept and his resurrection in the light of Osiris, were undergone by Pythagoras, so that he now realized, not as a mere abstract theory but as a lived experience, the doctrine of the Logos light, or of the universal word, and that of human evolution through 7 planetary cycles. At each stage of this vertiginous ascent, the ordeals became increasingly formidable. 100 times was the hazard of death incurred, particularly if one's objective was to acquire dominion over occult forces and attain to the perilous practice of magic and theurgy. Like all great men, Pythagoras believed in his star. No path leading to knowledge could dishearten him. The dread of death could not deter him, for he perceived the life that lay beyond. Upon recognizing that he possessed an extraordinary fortitude of soul and that disinterested passion for wisdom which is the rarest of earthly attributes, the Egyptian priests disclosed to him the treasures of their experience. During his sojourn among them, he progressed daily, becoming imbued with divine knowledge. He mastered sacred mathematics and the science of numbers, or universal principles, which he formulated anew, establishing them as the core of his system. Furthermore, the severity of the Egyptian temple discipline impressed upon him the prodigious efficacy of the human will when wisely trained and exerted, and the infinite applications, both to body and to soul, of which it is capable. The science of numbers and the cultivation of the will, asserted the priests of Memphis, are the twin keys of magic. They unlock all the portals of the universe. It was in Egypt that Pythagoras acquired that sublime perspective which permits one to behold the spheres of life and of the sciences in concentric order, and to comprehend the involution of the spirit into matter through universal creation, as well as its evolution or reascent toward unity by means of that individual creation designated as the development of consciousness. Pythagoras had attained the summit of the Egyptian priesthood and was perhaps contemplating a return to Greece, when war, with all its attendant misery, erupted over the Nile Valley, sweeping the initiate of Osiris in an unforeseen direction. The despots of Asia had long contemplated the ruin of Egypt. For centuries past, their repeated incursions had foundered against the wisdom of Egyptian institutions, the authority of the priesthood, and the vigor of the pharaohs. Yet this sanctuary of the science of Hermes, a kingdom existing from time immemorial, was not destined to endure forever. Cambyses, son of the conqueror of Babylon, descended upon Egypt with his innumerable hosts, ravenous as clouds of locusts, and brought an end to the institution of the pharaohs, the origins of which were lost in the mists of antiquity. In the estimation of the sages, this constituted a catastrophe for the entire world. Hitherto, Egypt had shielded Europe from Asia. Her protective influence still reached across the entire Mediterranean basin through the sanctuaries of Phoenicia, Greece, and Etruria, with which the high Egyptian priesthood maintained constant communion. Once this rampart was overthrown, the bull with lowered head was poised to charge upon the lands of Greece. Pythagoras witnessed Cambyses' invasion of Egypt. He may have beheld the Persian despot, a worthy scion of the crowned tyrants of Nineveh and Babylon, pillage the temples of Memphis and Thebes, and demolish the sanctuary of Ammon. He may have seen Pharaoh Psammetichus led in chains before Cambyses, placed upon an eminence, and surrounded by the priests, the noble families, and the royal court. He may have witnessed the pharaoh's daughter, clad in tatters and followed by her maids of honor similarly degraded, and the young prince alongside 2,000 youth led forth with bits in their mouths and halters about their necks prior to their execution. He may have seen Pharaoh Psammetichus stifling his sobs before this horrific spectacle, while the infamous Cambyses, seated upon his throne, gloated over the anguish of his vanquished foe. A cruel yet instructive lesson of history, succeeding those of science. What a depiction of the animal nature unleashed in man, culminating in this monster of despotism who tramples all beneath his feet, and, through his horrific self-deification, imposes upon humanity the reign of an implacable destiny. Cambyses caused Pythagoras, along with a portion of the Egyptian priesthood, to be transported to Babylon, detaining him within its gates. This colossal city, which Aristotle likened to a country enclosed by walls, offered at that time an immense field for observation. Ancient Babel, the great harlot of the Hebrew prophets, became after the Persian conquest, more than ever, a pandemonium of nations, tongues, and creeds, in the midst of which Asiatic despotism reared its dizzying tower. According to Persian tradition, its foundation dated back to the legendary Semiramis. It was she who was said to have constructed the monstrous fortified enclosure, over 50 miles in circumference. The Imager Bell, its walls upon which 2 chariots could drive abreast, its superimposed terraces, massive palaces adorned with polychromatic reliefs, and temples supported by stone elephants and surmounted by multicolored dragons. There had followed in succession a dynasty of despots who had subjugated Chaldea, Assyria, Persia, a portion of Tartara, Judea, Syria, and Asia Minor. Hither Nebuchadnezzar, the executioner of the Magi, had led captive the Jewish people, who continued to practice their faith in one corner of the immense city, a metropolis large enough to have contained London 4 times over. The Jews had even provided the great king with a powerful minister in the person of the prophet Daniel. Under Balthasar, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, the defenses of ancient Babel finally vanished beneath the avenging hand of Cyrus, and Babylon passed for several centuries under Persian rule. By virtue of this succession of preceding events, at the time of Pythagoras's arrival, three distinct religions coexisted within the high priesthood of Babylon. The ancient Chaldean priests, the survivors of the Persian Magi, and the elite of the Jewish captivity. The proof that these disparate priesthoods maintained mutual accord on esoteric matters is found in the role played by Daniel, who, while acknowledging the God of Moses, remained chief minister under Nebuchadnezzar, Balthasar, and Cyrus. Pythagoras was now compelled to expand his already vast horizon by studying these doctrines and religions, the synthesis of which was still preserved by a select few initiates. In Babylon, he was enabled to study thoroughly the lore possessed by the Magi, the heirs of Zoroaster. Although the Egyptian priests alone possessed the universal keys to the sacred sciences, the Persian Magi enjoyed the reputation of carrying the practice of certain arts even further. They claimed to control those occult forces of nature termed pantomorphic fire and astral light. In their temples, it was said, darkness reigned in broad daylight, lamps ignited without human agency. The radiance of the gods became visible, and the rumble of thunder could be heard. The Magi designated this incorporeal fire, the agent that generates electricity which they could condense or disperse at will, as the celestial lion, and applied the term serpents to the electric currents of the atmosphere and the magnetic currents of the earth, which they claimed to direct like arrows against mankind. Furthermore, they had made a specialized study of the suggestive, attractive, and creative power of the spoken word. To evoke spirits, they employed graduated formulas derived from the most ancient tongues on earth. The following is the psychic reasoning they themselves offered for this practice. Alter not the barbarous names employed in evocation, for they are the pantheistic names of God, magnetized by the worship of multitudes, and their power is ineffable. These evocations, accompanied by prayer and purification, constituted, properly speaking, what was designated in later times as white magic. Thus, we now behold Pythagoras in Babylon, penetrating the arcana of ancient magic. Simultaneously, within this den of despotism, he witnessed a glorious spectacle. Upon the ruins of the crumbling religions of the East, and high above their decimated and degenerate priesthoods, a band of dauntless initiates, bound together, defended their science, their faith, and, to the utmost of their ability, justice. Boldly confronting despots, like Daniel in the lion's den, ever prepared to be torn asunder, they tamed and fascinated the wild beast of absolute power by their intellectual prowess, contesting, foot by foot, every span of ground they had won. Following his Egyptian and Chaldean initiations, the son of Samos possessed a knowledge of natural philosophy far exceeding that of his preceptors, and vastly superior to that of any contemporary Greek, whether priest or layman. He was conversant with the eternal principles of the universe and their application. Nature had disclosed her secrets to him. The dense veils of matter had been rent from his eyes, enabling him to perceive the wondrous spheres of creation and a spiritualized humanity. Within the sanctuaries of Neith Isis in Memphis and of Bel in Babylon, he had acquired profound knowledge regarding the ancient history of religions, continents, and races. He had been permitted to contrast the merits and deficiencies of Jewish monotheism, Greek polytheism, Hindu Trinitarianism, and Persian dualism. He understood that all these faiths were but divergent rays of a singular truth, filtered through varying levels of human intellect and adapted to diverse social conditions. Through esoteric science, he possessed the key the ultimate synthesis of all these doctrines. His vision, encompassing the past and penetrating the future, was destined to judge the present with singular lucidity. His experience revealed to him a humanity imperiled by the most dire calamities, born of the ignorance of the priesthood, the materialism of the scholars, and the absence of discipline within the democracies. Amidst this universal decay, he observed the expansion of Asiatic despotism, a dark cloud from which a devastating tempest was poised to burst upon a defenseless Europe. Consequently, the hour had arrived to return to Greece, there to fulfill his mission and initiate his life's work. Pythagoras had been detained in Babylon for 12 years. To depart from the city, a decree from the king of Persia was indispensable. Democedes, his compatriot and the royal physician, interceded on his behalf and secured the philosopher's freedom. After an absence of 34 years, Pythagoras returned to Samos. He found his homeland subjugated and devastated by a satrap of the great king. Schools and temples stood closed. Poets and scholars had fled like a flock of swallows before the advance of Persian Caesarism. He received the consolation, however, of attending the final moments of Hermodamas, his earliest master, and of reuniting with his mother, Parthenes, the sole individual who had never doubted his return. For all others believed that the adventurous son of the Samian jeweler had perished. Never for an instant had she doubted the oracle of Apollo. Indeed, she divined that beneath the white robes of the Egyptian priest, her son was preparing himself for a sublime destiny. She knew that from the temple of Neith-Isis would emerge the beneficent master, the harbinger of light, of whom she had dreamed in the sacred grove of Delphi, and whom the Hierophant of Adonai had promised her beneath the cedars of Lebanon. And now, a light vessel was bearing mother and son toward a new exile over the azure waves of the Aegean Sea. Fleeing with all their possessions from a subjugated and ruined Samos, they set sail for Greece. Neither Olympic wreaths nor the laurels of the poet enticed the son of Parthenes. His task was far grander and more mysterious: to reawaken the slumbering soul of the gods within their sanctuaries, to restore the temple of Apollo to its pristine authority and grandeur, and subsequently to establish a school of science and of life from which would emerge, not demagogues and sophists, but initiated men and women, true mothers and pure heroes. Chapter 3. The Temple of Delphi, the Science of Apollo, the Theory of Divination, the Pythoness Theoclia. From the plain of Phocis, the traveler ascends the smiling meadows bordering the banks of the Pleistus to plunge into a winding valley enclosed by towering mountains. With every step, the path narrows, and the landscape grows more sublime and desolate. At length, one reaches an amphitheater of rugged mountains crowned with wild, precipitous peaks, a veritable crucible of atmospheric electricity, where tempests frequently rage. Suddenly, high within the somber gorge, the town of Delphi appears like an eagle's eyrie, perched upon a cliff surrounded by chasms and dominated by the twin peaks of Parnassus. From afar, the bronze victories are seen glittering in the light, alongside the brazen steeds and the countless golden statues marshaled along the sacred way, arrayed like a guard of heroes and deities surrounding the Doric temple of Phoebus Apollo. This was the most hallowed sanctuary in Greece. Here, the Pythoness uttered her prophecies and the Amphictyonic council assembled. Here, the various Hellenic peoples had erected votive chapels around the sanctuary to house their treasured offerings. Here, solemn processions of men, women, and children, journeying from distant lands, ascended the sacred way to pay homage to the god of light. From time immemorial, religious devotion had consecrated Delphi to the veneration of the people. Its central position within Hellas, and its precipitous site, sheltered from profane intrusion and easily defended, had greatly contributed to this preeminence. The locale was uniquely suited to captivate the imagination, for a singular phenomenon endowed it with immense prestige. Within a cavern behind the temple lay a fissure in the rock, whence issued a cold, vaporous mist that was said to induce a state of divine inspiration and ecstasy. Plutarch relates that in bygone times, a shepherd, seated beside this fissure, began to prophesy. Initially regarded as a madman, his subsequent predictions were realized, prompting the people to investigate. The priesthood assumed control of the site and consecrated it to the deity. Thus arose the institution of the Pythoness, who was seated upon a tripod directly above the crevice. The vapors exhaling from the abyss induced convulsions and extraordinary crises, provoking in her that faculty of second sight observed in certain somnambulists. Aeschylus, whose testimony carries profound weight, for he was the son of a priest of Eleusis and himself an initiate, informs us in his Eumenides, through the mouth of the Pythoness, that Delphi was consecrated first to the earth, then to Themis, subsequently to Phoebe, and ultimately to Apollo, the solar deity. Within the symbolism of the temple, each of these names represents vast epochs, encompassing centuries of time. The true renown of Delphi, however, dates from the era of Apollo. Jupiter, as the poets relate, desiring to locate the center of the earth, released two eagles from the east and the west, which met at Delphi. Whence arose this prestige, this universal and undisputed authority that established Apollo as the preeminent deity of Greece and renders the glory of his name so inexplicable to us. History remains silent on this crucial point. Should one consult orators, poets, and philosophers, they will offer only superficial explanations. The true solution to this enigma remained the closely guarded secret of the sanctuary. Let us endeavor to fathom it. In Orphic cosmology, Dionysus and Apollo represented two distinct revelations of the selfsame divinity. Dionysus represented esoteric truth, the essence and inner reality of existence, accessible solely to initiates. He held dominion over the mysteries of life, past and future incarnations, and the relations between soul and body, heaven and earth. Apollo personified this very truth as applied to terrestrial existence and social order. As the inspirer of poetry, medicine, and jurisprudence, he represented science through divination, beauty through art, concord among nations through justice, and harmony between soul and body through purification. In short, to the initiate, Dionysus signified nothing less than the divine spirit evolving throughout the universe, while Apollo represented its manifestation to humanity on earth. This concept had been conveyed to the populace by means of a legend. The priests related that, in the age of Orpheus, Bacchus and Apollo had contended for the tripod of Delphi. Bacchus had willingly yielded it to his brother, retiring to one of the summits of Parnassus, where the Theban women were accustomed to celebrate his mysteries. In reality, the two sons of Jupiter divided the dominion of the cosmos between themselves. The one reigned over the mysterious beyond, the other over the world of the living. Thus, we discern in Apollo the solar logos, the universal word, the mighty mediator, the Vishnu of the Hindus, the Mithras of the Persians, and the Horus of the Egyptians. Nevertheless, the ancient tenets of Asiatic esotericism assumed, within the legend of Apollo, a plastic beauty and an incisive splendor that allowed them to penetrate more deeply into human consciousness, akin to the very shafts of the deity. White-winged serpents leaping forth from his golden bow, as Aeschylus describes. Apollo emerges from the profound night of Delos. All the goddesses hail his birth as he strides forth to claim his bow and lyre. His locks stream upon the wind. His quiver resounds upon his shoulder. The sea trembles, and the entire island grows luminous with his glory, diffused in torrents of golden flame. This constitutes the epiphany of divine light, which, through its august presence, engenders order, splendor, and harmony, of which poetry is but the wondrous echo. The god journeys to Delphi, where he pierces with his arrows a monstrous serpent that had been ravaging and desolating the land. He purifies the region and establishes his temple, symbolizing the triumph of this celestial light over darkness and evil. Within ancient religions, the serpent symbolized simultaneously the inexorable cycle of existence and the attendant evils thereof. Yet, from this very existence, once comprehended and mastered, knowledge issues forth. Apollo, the vanquisher of the serpent, represents the initiate who penetrates nature through intellect, tames it by force of will, and, severing the karmic bonds of the flesh, ascends in spiritual splendor, whilst the shattered remnants of human animality lie writhing in the sand. For this reason, Apollo is the Lord of expiation, governing the purification of both soul and body. Sullied by the monster's blood, he performed penance, purifying himself during an 8-year exile amidst the bitter, restorative laurels of the Vale of Tempe. As the educator of mankind, Apollo deigns to dwell in their midst. He takes pleasure in the company of youths within the cities, presiding over poetic contests and the palestra, though his sojourn is but temporary. With the advent of autumn, he retreats to his own domain, the land of the Hyperboreans. These are a mysterious people of luminous and translucent souls, dwelling in the perpetual dawn of perfect beatitude. Here reside his true priests and his beloved priestesses. He abides with them in profound and intimate communion, and when he desires to bestow a sovereign gift upon humanity, he summons from the realm of the Hyperboreans one of those grand, radiant souls, destined to be born on earth to instruct and delight mortals. He himself returns to Delphi each springtide, when hymns and paeans are sung in his honor. Invisible to all save initiates, he arrives clothed in dazzling Hyperborean splendor, borne in a chariot drawn by melodiously singing swans. Once more he establishes his presence within the sanctuary, where the Pythoness pronounces his oracles, while sages and poets hearken. Then is heard the melody of nightingales. The Castalian spring disperses its silver spray in every direction, while effulgent light and celestial music penetrate the heart of man, reaching the very veins of nature. Within this legend of the Hyperboreans, much light is cast upon the esoteric foundation of the Apollonian myth. The land of the Hyperboreans represents the beyond, the empyrean of triumphant souls, whose astral auroras illuminate its multicolored zones. Apollo himself personifies that immaterial and intelligible light of which the physical sun is but a material reflection, and from which all truth emanates. The wondrous swans that bear him symbolize the poets and divine geniuses, messengers of his majestic solar soul, who leave in their wake flashes of light and strains of sublime music. Consequently, the Hyperborean Apollo personifies the descent of the celestial realm to earth, the incarnation of spiritual beauty in flesh and blood, and the influx of transcendent truth through. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.